Hi, Clayton.
Hi, Bob.
How you
Thanks for
doing?
having me. Good, good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of the Wright Show. This is Meaning of Life TV. You're Clayton Critcher, a psychologist at UC Berkeley. Your appointment is actually at the business school at UC Berkeley, I gather, and that's going to lead me to ask you why you're studying what you're studying, which we're going to talk about. But that is where your appointment is, right?
Yeah, my primary appointment is in the business school in marketing, but my background, my PhD is in social psychology. So I'm in an area of social psychology called judgment decision making. So we try to figure out how do people make judgments about the world? How do they make decisions about their own lives? And so most of us who are psychologists in that area are actually in business schools, given the relevance to kind of the marketplace. But most of my research is kind of just general psychology research.
Okay. Well, in addition to judgments about the world, you seem interested in judgments about otherworldly things, because what we're going to talk about is research you've done on belief in God and what contributes to belief in God. Broadly speaking, we're talking about the question that feelings play in belief in God. And the feeling you focused on is inspiration, right? And
That's right.
could you say that one question you're getting at is like kind of a chicken and egg question? Okay, granted that people who believe in God are prone to inspiration, which is one thing you kind of document in early in your series of studies. Which is causing which, to what extent? Is it that believing in God makes you inspired, or is it that being prone to inspiration makes you believe in God, right? That's a lot of what you're trying to untangle here.
Yeah, I think that's a basic question. A lot of the research that looks at correlates of either spirituality or religiosity or just belief in God has just been correlational in nature, and kind of a basic mantra in social science research is correlation doesn't imply causation. So just because we know that religious people, for example, tend to be happier, we don't know if it's that being religious causes you to be happier, or if happier people naturally gravitate toward religion. So we became interested in this question, as you mentioned, with regards to emotional experiences. In part, this came from, I think, for many scientists, and I'll say myself included, tend not to be particularly religious or particularly spiritual. In part, that comes from the role that faith almost necessarily plays in a belief in God or in theistic belief systems, and it's kind of incompatible, or at least hard to reconcile for many people with the scientific method or a purely analytical approach to the world. So I come from a very conservative area of the country. I come from Shreveport, Louisiana. My uncle is a Southern Baptist minister. So I grew up going to churches and going to very evangelical churches.
I
Not that my
grew up
parents
going to
did, yeah.
Southern Baptist churches too, so
Oh yeah. So
I know what it was
you're aware
like.
of that. Yeah. And one thing that always struck me, especially as a child, is especially at my uncle's church, which is kind of one of these new non-denominational evangelical churches, is they have a lot of really inspiring music. I mean, a lot that is kind of patterned on, I think, the formulas of pop music, and that kind of resonates with people. And, people become so carried away emotionally that they would, lift their hands in the air and kind of feeling that connection, or what felt, at least to them, like this connection with God. It's been kind of a long time interest then. And even though I think for many scientists, they wouldn't say an emotional experience is proof of some belief, but I think for many people, those types of emotional experiences do contribute to these belief systems. And so that's kind of the origin of the idea.
A hypothesis just occurred to me while you were talking. Maybe the reasons that Unitarians don't tend not to believe in God is, have you ever heard the music they play at Unitarian services? Not very inspiring.
It's pretty flat and boring.
It borders on atonal. No, not quite, but it's not as uplifting as some classic Baptist hymns, some classic gospel stuff. But I'm mainly kidding, of course. But
Yeah.
Anyway, so you got interested in this question partly through your own religious upbringing.
Yeah, my parents were not particularly religious, but they took me to church, and I grew up in a religious community. So it's been a long interest, kind of what is it that gives rise to these sorts of beliefs? Yeah.
Okay, And before we get into inspiration, you mentioned the kind of affective correlates, I guess you could say, of religious belief. First of all, there are really two different things. There's religiosity, broadly speaking, which it could include just going to church and being part of a community. But you are really studying belief, actual belief in God in this work. And those are kinds of two not necessarily the same things. What does the literature say, before we get to your work, broadly speaking, about kind of feelings and dispositions that are correlated with either religiosity broadly or actual belief in God?
Yeah. So I think, as you pointed out, one part of religiosity, especially meaning organized religion, is usually that involves also these community elements of, and that's one thing that even my own family, my mother really misses about church. She wishes there was some sort of community replacement for that, because she's not she doesn't believe in God, and so she thinks, and I think as many Americans do, it would be great to have an outlet for people like that to have that same sort of community experience. So one thing that you see that's a predictor of religiosity, but not necessarily belief in God, is just that people who feel a little bit more outcast, or they're looking for more social connections. They don't feel as fulfilled in terms of having a community, are the types of people who gravitate more toward organized religion. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they believe any specific dogma or just believe in God any more than do other people. When you look at things that predict belief in God, but not necessarily organized religion, we see more of these things that have to do with experiences that people have. Some of these are emotional in nature. Some of these are just other unexplained experiences. One finding that I like is that people who actually have report at least occasionally having auditory hallucinations. So not people that we'd say classify as like schizophrenics, not sort of to that level, but just sort of unexplained perceptual experiences. When those experiences tend to be positive and unexplained, people tend to attribute those to God or to spiritual forces. When those are more negative, people don't tend to attribute it to God in the same way. And then kind of where we came in is looking at some of these classes of emotions that we might call self-transcendental emotions. So emotions like inspiration, or even like awe, that sort of get us outside of ourselves and make us feel part of something that's bigger than just who we are.
And what is the difference between awe and inspiration? You hear both in connection with religion, but they seem clearly related, but you're clear that you're focusing on inspiration and not awe. So what would you say is the difference, first of all?
Yeah, so, I think there are a number of emotions: awe, inspiration, adoration, admiration. A lot of these are things that emotion researchers and academics spend a lot of time thinking about. What are the differences? I think it's tough in that I think for many lay people, I'm not sure they fully identify or experience these things in a fully differentiated manner. The way that people have defined awe is thinking about two different elements. So one is being exposed to something that is perceptually vast, and then combining that with the idea that it's really hard to cognitively accommodate, or it's kind of a fancy way of saying fully understand what it is that you're seeing. So people talk about...
so there's an element of wonder implied.
Yeah, there's a sense of wonder, a sense of, people talk about mathematical equations that are very complex as maybe being awe-inspiring, as there's something that are metaphorically vast, but hard to fully understand what it is that they're being exposed to.
If you go far enough back in the word's history, don't you have an element of fear kind of associated with awe?
Yeah, I think that's also one differentiator between awe and inspiration. So awe can also have these negative affective components like fear that you're referring to, whereas inspiration we tend to think of as more just being elicited by positive elicitors. Inspiration also has a sense that there's an action component. So we are both inspired by things, but then often we're inspired by things, we're then inspired to do things as a result of that inspiration. Whereas awe and emphasizing that it doesn't come with this complete understanding of what you're even exposed to. There's not necessarily that same sort of follow-up step in terms of that you're then inspired to do something.
Okay. And this distinction between being inspired by someone or something and being inspired to do something specific figures into your work. We'll get into that. So for starters, first thing you did was you showed that to judge by people's reports by how often they feel inspired, there is a correlation between propensity toward inspiration and propensity to believe in God. There you used a kind of a scale that people, where they can say they're sure there's no God, they're sure there is a God, or the two are equally probable, and gradations in between, and so on. So you give them the survey that measures strength of belief in God. And so for starters, you find the correlation between inspiration and belief in God. And that's when it gets kind of difficult, right, is to start figuring out to what extent the causality works in which direction, right?
Right. So, as you mentioned, we find that people who more frequently in their day-to-day lives feel inspired, and also when that inspiration is more intense, those are the same people who are religious. But as you say, it could be that people who are just more religious or believe in God more to begin with, maybe they naturally identify things in their lives more in terms of inspiration. You could say inspiration itself is kind of a religious term, or it's used in religious contexts. So it's unclear whether it's the emotion causing the belief in God causing people to at least report that they feel that emotion more often, or maybe there's something else we haven't even thought of that causes people both to believe in God and feel inspired more.
And then, so to get at this question, then you started, one thing you did is expose people to certain conditions, certain songs and things that they might find inspiring. How did that work?
Yeah, so at first what our initial intent was we thought, well, maybe what we can do is first we can measure before people ever come into our behavioral labs here at Berkeley, maybe we can just measure their baseline belief in God. And then we can put them through different experiences and see if people who are inspired by those experiences change their belief in God from baseline or from what they already had compared to those who didn't feel inspired. So this is one way to get at the causal question. If we can use statistics to control for how religious people are to begin with and then see how they shift in response to experience, that's a slightly better way of saying, does the experience of inspiration predict belief in God? So initially, we just tried a variety of things, thinking that maybe only inspiration that comes from certain types of elicitors would produce belief in God, but not across the board. So we used things ranging from watching Susan Boyle, the famous member of the British, she appeared on a British reality TV show, had a dramatic opera singing performance that was quite inspiring, that video. We even showed people, showed one group of people a music video by the hip-hop artist Flo Rida, which initially we did not think would be something that if you're inspired by that, you would believe in God more. We showed people the climactic moments of Remember the Titans, and also had some people listen to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It turned out, regardless of what it was that people watched, those who felt more inspired by it, even by the music video to Club Can't Handle Me Right Now, they reported a little bit elevated belief in God after that compared to those who weren't inspired.
And compared to their own prior disposition.
Exactly.
And this is to judge by their own reports of whether they found it inspiring, right?
That's right.
That's your index of inspiration. It's not like you were measuring it physiologically or anything. You were relying on them. And then after they told you how inspiring they felt it, then you asked them belief in God questions.
That's right. We've basically done things where we vary the order in which we ask about how inspired were you in the belief in God, because maybe there's one concern that after you focus people on how inspired they were, maybe if they see some connection between the idea of inspiration and belief in God, that could contaminate things. So, but that's essentially what we did. Yeah.
Right. And you can also imagine confounding factors like the fact that Martin Luther King is himself known to be religious. So when you hear him give the speech, you may be thinking about, but what you're saying is actually that did not matter. More secular sources of inspiration were equally powerful.
Yeah, exactly. More secular sources of information. And I think this is also where it's really important that we trace variation between people and how inspired they were by things to that belief in God. So people who heard Martin Luther King speak, even though they might have an association between Martin Luther King and religiosity, those who were less inspired by the speech just didn't shift their beliefs in God as much as those who were more inspired by it.
Mm-hmm. Now, did they also listen to songs that nobody would find inspiring? Wouldn't that be one form of control where it's just like I don't know, I'm trying to think of a song, did you do that, or were these songs equally likely to lead people to say they felt inspired? Roughly, I mean, the songs and the speech and these different elicitors.
Yeah, so after sort of trying several of these elicitors that arguably were inspirational, like remember Titans or Martin Luther King, I mean that's why we then went to the Flow Rida video, which I think people would hardly say as inspiring, but we still saw that it turns out some people are inspired by the video, most people aren't. The ones who are still showing these shifts.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there probably is some floor. Probably if we showed people just, a static image of a cockroach, I don't know if anyone is going to feel inspired by that. So there probably is some way to push it where you would be
more inspired than by a moving image of a cockroach, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
So then what did you do? Then you did another round, right?
Yeah. You mean sort of where do we go next in terms of our studies from there? Yeah. So we wanted to go kind of the next step is, and you're sort of alluding to this in some of your questions, let's have some people clearly experience inspiration and some people not, and then see if we can get a difference between those groups and how much they say they believe in God in the moment. So one issue with the videos that we had used is even videos that we thought were pretty clearly inspiring, we were still struck by how many people didn't find the Martin Luther King video particularly inspiring. Perhaps they're just already too familiar with it, or just didn't strike a personal chord with them in modern times. And so we wanted people to identify fairly recent events in their lives which they had been inspired by something that was fairly recent, so that it would they'd still be able to sort of conjure up those strong emotional reactions to it. But then we also drew on this distinction in the inspiration literature between people who are inspired by things, or sometimes we're inspired by events. So those are elicitors. In other cases, we're just inspired to do something. So certain goals that we have in our life, we still use that idea of inspiration to say that we just have a very strong emotional feeling to want to accomplish those goals. We feel inspired to do those things. The way that we thought about...
Can I just interrupt? I mean, often, I think, you wind up, I think, arguing that it's the inspired by that is the big factor in belief in God, not inspired to. But in real life, aren't those very often kind of closely connected? I mean, football coaches, you're inspired by a football coach to play better football. And even, when I think of times when I get inspired to do more work and think I can accomplish great things, it rarely happens in a vacuum. It's usually inspired by something identifiable, whether it's a person who says something or just something I see at a moment when I'm thinking about my work or something, right? So isn't that kind of a fine line?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think there's two things there. So one, when you think about the sort of whole complex causal sequence of how an inspirational episode unfolds, usually it is, as you say, we're inspired by something, and many times then we're ultimately inspired to do something because of that. So we might look to role models. We might feel inspired by them. And then if we feel that they're modeling a sort of achievement that maybe we too could achieve, then we feel inspired to try to model that behavior as well. I think we can think of certain episodes where we're just inspired by something, maybe some sort of brilliant performance that doesn't necessarily inspire us to do something then. because we don't think it's necessarily achievable ourselves, or it's not obvious what we would do next. And there's certain goals that we feel very inspired to try to achieve. Maybe there was some time in the distant past where we were originally inspired by something. Maybe that's what kind of inspired that zeal that we now have. But when we experience that inspiration to do something in the moment, it's so temporally disconnected from the initial elicitor that I think we experience those as different. But as you point out, and when we measure both of these things, psychologists have developed scales to measure the difference between inspired by and inspired to. They're always correlated, so they're not independent. Okay. But when we look at which is the part that predicts belief in God, it's always the inspired by part, not the inspired to part.
Okay, so when you did this thing where you brought people in and said, I think the way it worked is you reflect on some time in the past when you've been inspired by something. Mm-hmm. What were typical things that, I mean, maybe you don't know because they didn't have to articulate them. I don't know if they did have to articulate them, but what do you know? What are some examples of things people thought of? Was it like, well, I came upon this beautiful sunset, I saw a flock of seagulls, what?
Yeah. So I'd say, so actually I did read all of them because one thing we were worried about is we wanted to make sure the results wouldn't be driven by people who said they were inspired by when they were in church and their minister said something, because that could be an artifact. Yeah. And so I forget exactly how many people are in the condition where they're thinking inspired by, around 100 people in our average study. Usually just about 3 or 4 of them actually mention explicitly religious content. I'd say more often is they're talking about something that more relates to some sort of nature experience they had, or maybe a family member of theirs who had maybe battled a disease in an inspirational way, or had their grandmother who had modeled for them the right type of person to be, or someone who was older than them in their fraternity or sorority who they thought was a model citizen in that organization. I'd say those are sort of the most common types of things.
And just to delve a little more into the psychology of inspiration, it seems like all of those cases are in a certain sense inspiring you to do something. I mean, it seems like you're probably always going to be better to confront things in general that happen a minute later, right? I mean, you're feeling better about life, better about what the human spirit can accomplish and so on, but you're not being inspired to accomplish some narrow, specific task, right?
Yeah, so I think even if you, in response to being inspired by those people, even if there is then also then an inspired to response from that, I think it's important that it's not that degree of inspired to response that ends up predicting our effects or the belief in God. I mean, I think this also relates to just sort of the broader question of, what exactly psychologically is going on? Why would it be that these sorts of emotional experiences connect to a belief in God? So what we argue in the paper is that if you look across various psychological literatures, there's kind of a general pattern that you can see, and I can describe an example from my own work also, where if there's something out there that would cause something else, so a cause and an effect, when we see or experience that effect, we sort of naturally infer the cause, even if other things could actually give rise to that effect. So let me give a concrete example that's not about religion, but that kind of illustrates this point. So a while ago, with my co-author, Jane Risen, who's a professor at the University of Chicago at the business school there, we were interested in whether or not people believed in global warming or not. So global warming, I mean, it has a similarity with some of these religious questions in that in some ways we have to take it on faith that scientists are right, that we're moving toward more of this climate change emergency, but that can feel kind of abstract and maybe hard to directly visualize or experience when we're thinking about these things in the future. And so we showed that if we can put people in situations, quite literally in some experiments, a room that is heated up to be 8 degrees warmer than a usual room, people then believe in global warming more. And in part, that's because it's just easier for them to visualize or think about what exactly is it going to feel like if we achieve that sort of global warming state. Or in another study, we gave people a bunch of pretzels, didn't give them any water to drink. It was ostensibly a marketing taste test. And then we showed them a video that the American Southwest may be running out of potable drinking water. If they had just eaten those pretzels and they were thirsty in the moment, they found that video more convincing because it's just easier to kind of personally resonate with or imagine what would it be like if we didn't have enough potable drinking water when you're thirsty in the moment as opposed to when you're sated in the moment or quenched in the moment. And so I think there's something similar here where if you look at what is the profile of the experience of inspiration or the experience of awe, it's things like being exposed to something more powerful or beautiful or exalted compared to the self, feeling in a state of submission compared to something perceptually vast, something of uncertain form that you're not exactly clear what that is. Now, we know the reason people are feeling inspired is because we showed them Susan Boyle or we showed them the Martin Luther King speech, or in some cases, right, we even showed them this hip-hop music video that some people find inspired. But people sort of show this tendency that if God's true existence would give rise to a feeling of inspiration, feeling inspired is sort of one intuitive cue then to infer the existence of God.
So then in the second stage, what you did is you asked them to, again, to recall an episode when they were inspired by something, and that had the same effect of tending to strengthen their belief, to make them more disposed to believe in God relative to their prior disposition, right? Now,
That's right.
I was thinking that would be hard for me if somebody asked me when I don't know. Now, you gave them guidance, and I was going to ask you about this because I wondered whether the guidance you gave them didn't kind of, encourage, push them a little bit in the direction of God. I mean, what you said, I think this is your guidance, right? You said, when we say inspired by, we do not mean you were specifically inspired to do something. Instead, we mean that someone or something awakened in you an exalted feeling of transcendence, an appreciation of something grand beyond your ordinary capacities, kind of reminds me of God, an experience that carried you beyond mundane concerns, mundane often used in contrast to, otherworldly or supernatural or transcendent, mundane concerns of everyday life to experience something important and beautiful. So, Matt, I mean, was that a concern that you was it a challenge to describe inspiration without loading the deck,
Yes, yeah, sure. That's a good
dice?
question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two issues in there. So one, and this sort of relates back to this point that, part of what we think is going on is just the notion of inspiration itself is something that very much characterizes the way that one would relate to a greater or spiritual being, right? And that's you point out some of those things in reading the definition. So I think one, that's the reason, or that's sort of the value of the studies where we just expose people to, say, the videos, don't characterize them in those terms. Kind of as I was referring to earlier, one problem, though, with those studies is people don't have a uniformly inspirational experience. And one thing, let me quickly note that's sort of interesting about that, and then I'll come back and say a second thing on your question, is that we actually found some evidence that if you're looking at something that most people would feel is very inspiring, but you yourself aren't particularly moved by it, if anything, there's a little bit of a backfiring effect. So if you know that that Martin Luther King's speech is something that, most people find this inspiring, but I'm just kind of feeling nothing while listening to this, then people move a little bit in the opposite direction. Anyway, I point that out because it's sort of a challenge for how do you make sure you use a manipulation that everybody will respond to as inspiring.
Or it's kind of like if you hear classical music and go, oh, I hate classical music. That wouldn't have been your reaction if you had just heard it without understanding that a lot of people like it, probably, right? I mean, you're defining your taste relative to what you know other people's tastes are. Yeah,
I have been at, embarrassed to say, some symphony performances where I feel nothing, and I think, wow, I am particularly uncultured if I am not responding to this, that I know it. So similar psychology to that. So that, that's kind of the reason why we wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page of thinking of something that for they themselves would be particularly inspiring. But as you point out, it raises this other problem. To what extent are you essentially using religious language and then getting people to respond that they have religious beliefs. So that's where kind of the second part of our evidence is so important, where we measure, there's still variation between people and how much they're actually able to sort of get worked up and feel inspired there in the lab in thinking about these inspirational experiences. This is where we can think about, how do we catalog what's the power, the effect of our treatment being, think of an inspirational time, and can we trace variation in that treatment strength to variation in the output? So it's a little bit like, you could imagine a clinical drug study in which you may give people only half of what they think is or half of what you know is the best dosage level of a drug, but everyone thinks that they're getting the drug. If it's just sort of a placebo effect or just something where people think that they're getting the treatment, then it shouldn't matter. If that's all that's going on, it shouldn't matter whether they get half of the effective treatment or the full treatment. We basically find that it matters whether you're getting half of the effective treatment. In other words, you're only feeling somewhat inspired in reliving this event, or you get the full treatment. You're feeling
so the
full.
Passage I read would correspond to the full treatment in that analogy?
Well, so in other words, everyone reads that passage, but essentially there's variation between people and how much that passage really moves them to come up with a memory that is moving them in the moment. So if it were just that reading religious language or something that could be construed as religious language, and I think you're totally right to say that that's a potential problem. If that's all that we're going on, so you say, think of something that is beyond the mundane, then it shouldn't have mattered if people were kind of only experiencing that as a half dose or as a full dose of our manipulation. Instead, if it's merely that language, then we should have seen similar sorts of effects. I'd say the even more foolproof solution, because I think what you raise is a good point. This is something we're actually right now trying to figure out how to do. Is if Susan Boyle or if even Martin Luther King doesn't inspire everyone, is there something we can find that's even better, that basically across the board everyone's going to inspire everyone? So maybe we could, for example, just pre-select participants that we know are particularly moved by a certain type of art or a certain type of movie or a certain type of music. And if we only included those people in our studies and then randomly assign them to be exposed to that type of inspirational music or not, we could get around the problem that you're alluding to of not bringing up religious language at all in these sorts of manipulations, but also having confidence that we're finding people that we know will all respond to the manipulation as we want. Okay.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about spiritual transcendence and this this chart.
That complex box and arrow chart.
Whose interconnections may not be immediately obvious to everyone, including me. I mean, the whole meaning of it. But first, is there anything you want to say about the sequence of experiments you did? We haven't run all the way through the program. I think we've given people the basic idea. You looked at correlation, you looked at causality in a couple of different ways in causal direction. Anything else you want to say to cap that off?
You mean sort of as relates to now this final part, or before we get into the final part of the...
Either as preparation for talking about spiritual transcendence, or you can tackle it yourself. I mean, if people can see on this chart, there's like spiritual transcendence is in the middle right here, and then there's an arrow toward belief in God, which I guess represents kind of degree of influence or something. There's a number there we won't get into.
Yeah,
there's connectedness up here. There's the inspiration is over here, I think. Anyway.
I'll walk through kind of what that means.
Okay.
I'll say kind of the loose motivation for this. There's a little bit of a pattern or a formula in the way that psychologists try to do research, whether it's on spirituality or whatever topic. We try to say that A causes B. So in this case, inspiration causes a belief in God, and we try to yield some insight into what is it that it kind of happens along that connecting arrow between A and B. So that's more of the why exactly does A cause B. So in some of the previous work that's most similar to this research that's looked at incidental experiences and how that might affect belief in God, there have been other what we call mediators, or things that fall in the middle of these causal chains that yield insight into why is it that people's belief in God is changing. So, for example, one thing that researchers have found recently is that essentially when I have a greater intolerance of uncertainty. So if things happen to me where I'm just less willing to approach the world with the idea of, I don't know, I don't understand this, and that's totally fine with me. If that sense is diminished, that's one thing that leads people to gravitate then toward a belief in God.
Now to be clear, your sense of confidence or your sense of what is diminished? That's what is diminished. You become less certain of, and that increases your chances to.
So maybe instead of less confidence, it's maybe less just a less reduced willingness to approach the world, feeling that it's okay that things aren't black and white out there. So I'm more uncomfortable. I'm more comfortable
with ambiguity.
If I'm more comfortable with ambiguity, then I have less of a need to gravitate towards something like a religious belief system or a belief in God that might offer a sense of structure or understanding for these.
And that's an actual finding?
Yeah, that's an actual finding. I mean, I think you also see that anecdotally. Right? There are people who suffer maybe great tragedies, a loss of a loved one. It's really hard to understand why that happened,
right.
And people will kind of look to religious structures or belief systems to offer that sense of closure or understanding. So when I'm more troubled by the uncertainty, if I'm looking for something to make the world more black and white, that's one thing that leads me to then go more toward these religious belief systems.
And is that in specific realms? I mean, for example, like purpose and moral orientation, like what career should I choose? How should I live my life? I can imagine how in that realm this effect would certainly apply. And I assume that this has been studied within specific realms.
Yeah, that's this is something that's still relatively new. It's not been explored. Having those sorts of intolerance of ambiguity in clearly secular, very mundane domains. A lot of this has looked at differences in how people feel in responding to things that relate to nature or other concerns. Some people might even say those are things that relate more directly to something potentially more spiritual. So yeah, I think those are great questions, and those are things people haven't, to my knowledge, explored yet.
So anyway, I got you off track a little bit.
Yeah,
anyway, your work on spiritual transcendence near the end of your paper.
Yeah, so basically we knew there were certain things that inspiration had an effect on people on, and we wanted to figure out which of those things might be kind of the pathway that connects the feeling of inspiration to greater belief in God. So one thing, what we call in the paper personal insignificance, my colleagues here at Berkeley, Dr. Keltner and his former student, Paul Piff, they talk about the small self, that essentially when you feel inspired, or they usually look at all, that you actually feel literally smaller, and I think that relates to sort of the perceptual vastness of the all-eliciting stimuli. So one idea is, maybe you feel small or insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Maybe that, if I'm small and a nobody, that makes me think perhaps there's this grand universe where there's a God that's in charge of things. And then kind of another thing we looked at was what we call connectedness or social connectedness. So how much, when I feel inspired, sort of the narrow boundaries of the self tend to sort of blur, and I feel a little bit more connected to those who are around me. So this is where I kind of like to point out, one thing in thinking about those childhood experiences of being in my uncle's church and these very inspirational experiences, part of what's nice about that is you're surrounded by these sea of people, and you sort of feel part of this community that's bigger than just you. And I think that's part of what really works there in building on that aspect of feeling inspired. And then we also measured this thing as called spiritual transcendence, which is essentially just asking people really to label that emotional experience that they had. Is that something that made them, that there was almost spiritual in nature or not?
So they actually used the word. You gave them the chance to use that word, the word spiritual.
Yeah, so in that case, the measure itself is, it almost blurs the distinction between a measure of belief in God or religiosity and the emotional experience. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but I think that changes kind of the way you should think about what that means. So I'd say the real mystery for us going in was, to what extent is it that feeling inspired makes you feel small, personally insignificant, and that's what's going on? I'm just one small person in this vast universe where there's a God, or is it I feel part of something bigger than myself? I feel connected to others around me and human race, and then from that, then I have more of these religious beliefs, and it's more that latter explanation. So we find, and what you put up there, we kind of use some fancy statistics to show that when I feel more inspired by something, that makes me feel part of something that's bigger than just me, part of something connected with other people, part of something bigger than the self. We basically label that then a spiritually transcendent experience. That's kind of what characterizes spiritually transcendent experiences. And then consistent with the logic that essentially what inspiration is almost an experiential proof of God's existence that then translates into belief in God. So I should say that, and as many scientists would be quick to point out, that complex graph, it's not a definitive causal proof of kind of the sequence that I laid out, but what it is it basically shows that our data is consistent with that causal sequence and less consistent with other causal sequences that we could try to flesh out based on those variables that we measured. So just to kind of quickly summarize, it goes from inspiration to feeling part of something greater than the self, which is something we label as a spiritually transcendent experience, which is what then leads to the elevated belief in God.
And it's transcendent partly in the sense of transcending the self.
Yeah, exactly. So what goes into a transcendent experience, when we feel personally insignificant and small, those aren't the types of experiences that we label as spiritually transcendent. When we have these inspirational experiences in which we feel connected to others, connected to something bigger than the self, those are the types of experiences we actually label as spiritually transcendent, which I think gives some insight, beyond these things that we just do in the lab, as what are maybe the big experiences people have in their lives that they might call conversion experiences. So the types of big, meaningful experiences that they might cite as something that's actually changing or encouraging them to have a belief in God. So my grandmother, who has now passed away, but she was not always especially religious. She became more religious in her life, and she actually has a conversion experience. She describes kind of feeling overwhelmed, sitting down by her bedside, praying, and having this sense that an enormous burden was lifted from her, and she just sort of felt this sense of unity with her family and those around her and other people. And she still cited that until the end of her life as kind of, that was her proof behind her faith for her that God did exist.
So that's kind of, in a sense, feeling the vastness and greatness of God without feeling diminished yourself relative to it. Whereas separately, as you pointed out, there's the possibility of actually feeling smaller. With respect to the thing you're in awe of, but that would be a little different.
Right. So, we talked earlier about part of what inspiration involves. I think part of what a relationship with a vast and powerful God involves is a subordination. But especially,
it can, although there it depends very much on the theological interpretation and context.
Right, and as you say, I think especially at least in modern day Christian contexts, I think there's less of that clear subordination, smallness, insignificance. I mean, if you look at modern day religious, especially Christian movements in this country, a lot of it is about personal empowerment through sort of religious origins. God wants you to be rich and successful, those sorts of messages. And so it's possible that the reason that we don't go see this pathway through personal insignificance is perhaps it's just because in the modern day context, that's not the way that people tend to relate to God or tend to conceive of God. Right. So that's something, of course, we can't travel forward or back in time to test, but that's certainly something possible.
Do you know the book, The Idea of the Holy by Rudolf Otto?
I don't know that.
It's more than 100 years old. It's a classic. He's a German, I think.
Uh-huh.
And he was. It's interesting because I mean, this is a vague recollection, probably entirely wrong, but he was doing kind of an anatomy of religious belief and of the evolution of religious belief. And in what I think he was probably calling primitive religion, he put a lot of emphasis on the experience of awe with a strong dimension of fear and, just an apprehension of something overpowering.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think he traced out a kind of what he saw as an evolution, which in his view, since he was a believing Christian, was an evolution toward a truer apprehension of God. And so you might say it was almost an evolution from awe in that kind of old-fashioned sense toward inspiration. But that kind of gets at what I think we're talking about, where different conceptions of God can lead to different kinds of feelings. And I guess I'd never thought of this, but a big question is, in sensing the vastness of God, do you feel diminished or in some sense, enriched and even empowered?
Yeah, so in one of our studies, in our early correlational studies, where we're not manipulating inspiration, but we're just looking at who is it that is believers, we included a measure that asks people basically, whether you believe in God or not, tell us what your conception of God is. It's a measure that others have developed that helps you differentiate. Do you see God as someone who is more loving and nurturing, or God as someone who is more controlling? Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of this positive versus negative kind of characterizations of a powerful being like God. So two things I think were interesting. So one is that if you just compared believers and non-believers, believers tended to have a much more loving, positive conception of God, and believers tended to see God as more of a controlling and negative figure. So I think that gives some insight into at least how modern-day believers tend to then conceive of God, more in this loving and positive, nurturing way. Mm-hmm. But the second thing that was interesting was that inspiration, people who feel more inspired in their day-to-day lives, they believed in God more regardless of their personal conception of God. So if you're someone who saw God as more of that controlling figure, you still believed in God a little bit more if you're someone, though, who went through life feeling more inspiration. So in other words, it's not just that there's a mismatch. It's not just that there is a positive match between feeling inspired and a loving, great, feel-good, positive conception of God. Instead, inspiration seems to lead to this greater sense of God, regardless of whether you have more of this loving or controlling picture of who God is.
Okay. Now, finally, toward the end of your paper, I think you make references toward what I would call, I don't think you use the term, but I would call a Durkheimian conception of the function of religion. In other words, the idea that religion is largely about strengthening social bonds, strengthening the social group. And I'm wondering, well, did I get that right? That you see in your work some sort of resonance with this kind of view of religion? And if so, exactly what is your view on this? I mean, do you have views about how religion came to be, whether it came to be by virtue of congealing societies or what?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's sort of two issues that come up there. So one is this question of, is one of the functions of religion in order to help to bind social communities? And then the second is more about to what extent is inspiration, or that specific emotional cause, is part of what it's doing, in addition to just promoting a belief in God, but also helping to offer kind of an emotional glue that underlies what exactly that type of social connection is. So it's hard for me as just an experimental psychologist to speculate on, kind of the deeper function of, is that why religion came to be? But I guess what I feel more confident saying is that there is a natural match between these emotions that are connected with religion, and then as a consequence of that, those are the types of emotions that also do bind together communities. So whether it is that religion came about in an effort to bind together communities, I don't know. Are the types of things that lead us to feel more of a belief in God and thus religious also the types of things that help us bind together? Yes. And so I think there's a natural marriage between those two. And so it's no coincidence or no surprise that religion then offers such a source of community, because not only does it literally offer a community of believers, but it offers the types of experiences that also make us feel more connected to other people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for taking the time, Clayton. We should say in closing that, in a sense, people are getting a sneak preview of this work because it hasn't been formally published. I gather you are in the a journal you are in the phase of editorial revision with a particular journal, so we can expect to see it somewhere. But I don't know what the rules are about talking about that until it's actually published.
Yeah, basically, it's received one round of peer review and was received fairly favorably. But yeah, we're now in the revision process, and so everything in academics moves so slow. So hopefully, hopefully within a year, people will see it, but we'll see.
Okay, until then, they'll have to settle for this. All right, well, thanks again so much, and good luck with the revisions and all your other work.
Thanks so much. It was very interesting.
Yeah, bye-bye.